Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby. I and the other trainers of KI, that's Dan McClintock, he's a co-developer, Ina, Toshi, Serena, these are names and faces that are coming across my social media. We are going to be doing themes for a while on social media to help people understand what they don't, which is that the buried emotions are driving suffering, like the science says. But because they're buried, we can't make the connections very easily at all between what's arising here in our experience and then what that's driven by, which is unconscious. So what I'm saying is the main duality is that, and we miss it. It is that we've buried emotions and they are producing falseness at the surface. And because those emotions are buried, we miss the main duality in non-duality. A lot of people missed it through the years. A lot of bypassing has happened. So because KI corrects that, helps people correct the bypassing and get directly to the avoidance through the buried emotions, we have to first talk about, I think, the avoidant spiritual path before I go into authentic relating. It's so connected because we're not authentically relating in our relationships. We can't. That's one of the signs of disconnection. And remember, the avoidant spiritual path is 3 signs, which would be 1, disconnection in relationship and life. You would actually feel that sense of separation in your body. And then number 2, because of that suffering, you seek to alleviate the suffering. But because you have buried emotions, you unknowingly turn everything into a bypass. You don't end your suffering, in other words. When you have buried emotions, you can't because you're driven by the need to stay safe and get love. And that's what's buried. That's the very conditioning that's buried that's creating the disconnection. So the thing that creates the disconnection and the bypass, the thing that creates the suffering and our failed attempts at alleviating the suffering is the same thing. Buried emotions, fear. And this is frozen. We can't be conscious of that. We can't rest and allow something that doesn't arise. And this is why we miss it, because it's buried under the water. And everything that we're experiencing here in the moment is just safer than and more conscious than what we've buried. So basically, when we're being with what is here in the moment, we're not. We're not even being with the vast majority of what is, which is buried, unprocessed fear and programming that constitutes most of consciousness. It's just like an iceberg. What you see here in your waking experience is just what's safe for you to experience. It's not reality. It's being produced by what you are refusing or afraid to feel. So we have to talk about the spiritual path because that's what people are doing is they're leaving their relationships. That's what I did. Disconnecting, trying to find answers to alleviate suffering, but then we move away from the solution the moment we do that. If we're looking for something to alleviate our suffering that flat out ignores why we're suffering, how are we going to end suffering? And that's what we're doing on the avoidant path. We don't know we have repression. We don't see it creates the suffering. Then we go look to alleviate the suffering. But we don't know that the buried emotions are creating that too. The seeking, the looking, and the picking of different practices and teachers. We're doing all things for safety, not for freedom, until we start to make the buried emotions conscious. And then we start living and relating a different way. And we don't have to treat spirituality or self-help as something that we do apart from our bodies, our relationships. This work is brought right into it, and you're encouraged to make this work a lived inquiry in your relationships so that you don't try to bypass the very driver of suffering, which would be the same thing creating suffering in your relationships as what creates the seeking, as I said, or the looking for answers. So we just want to put the whole duality, in my view, between relationship here and spirituality over here is keeping us safe. There's no duality there. Our suffering is coming from our bodies and it's happening in relationship. The moment we turn away from it, we're just trying to stay safe from it. even though we might think we want to be free. It's the unconscious that drives it all. And it demands safety no matter what we tell ourselves here in Talkland on the tip of the iceberg. Authentic relating. I had no idea what that was. You can't know what that is if you have buried emotions, because the buried emotions are making sure that whatever you experience is not authentically you, because that would just be too scary. So you get inauthentic you all day long, and then therefore suffering. You get stories, you get narratives, you get self-protection and self-defense and defensiveness and fighting and depression and anxiety and shutdown in relationship. And we can't talk about the real issues, and suffering continues because we can't. Can't say what's really true for us. We don't even know what it is. How could we know what's true for us? By just recognizing presence. That's just the context in which everything happens. It's important and indispensable to recognize present moment awareness. And so we want to bring that in, but that's not going to save us from the fact that we're creating suffering in the presence. That the recognition of presence doesn't save us from that, because we have to embody that to actually free ourselves from that mechanism of creating suffering. So in relationship, what I'm encouraging people first to do is not to leave your relationship to go meditate or do mindfulness practices without getting to buried emotions. Because that's part of the bypass and the avoidant path, is like staying out of the body, witnessing things that are safer, coming and going in the moment, and expecting something deeply transformative to happen in your life and in your relationship. And I guess it's not happening, is it? I mean, every bypass has benefits. So you've certainly, for those of you who do this, you've received benefit in some way. But are you free of the suffering of your relationship through your meditation or mindfulness practice? If you're honest, the answer is no. There's science behind that. Why you wouldn't have ended suffering. There's enough intelligence out there that we can discover it through AI. That present moment awareness, people who engage in present moment awareness practices, unconscious adults, they're avoiding buried emotions that way, because buried emotions don't arise. So if you could see right there, if buried emotions are creating my suffering in relationship, but I step outside my relationship to meditate or go to non-dual teachings that never get to the buried emotions, what am I doing? I'm not going for freedom, even if I tell myself that. So what am I doing? I'm trying to stay safe in the relationship and get love. And the other part of the ego is like, well, now I'm mindful and I'm meditating, like I'm really doing something. But if you're not getting to the buried emotions, you're still creating suffering in the relationship, and then you're just mindful of it, of the suffering you created. Is that clear? To just be mindful of the suffering that you're creating? I don't think so. It's not going to end our suffering. It's not going to give us the authentic relating, because it's too safe. Mindfulness, meditation, awareness practices are great for nervous system regulation and for recognizing the presence, but not for ending suffering, not for authenticity. You can get trapped, actually, I did, in a loop of mindfulness where you're just watching things come and go, but you never experience the driver of suffering because it's buried. So that's my number one thing is, can you just change your mindset? So many people are just leaving their relationships and looking outside of it for the answers. But when you do KI, you'll find that that's the problem. That's the avoidant path. So if you're going to do mindfulness and meditation, can you bring in KI into that practice? And that way you're not using spiritual practice to avoid the very drivers of the suffering in your relationship. And that's a first start, is just to have a good practice. Many people don't yet have that, so I start with that. Start a KI practice. 2 markers consistently. When you come work with us, you'll know what that means. That will bring about authenticity, not as a sudden release or experience because your buried emotions are keeping that from happening. But if you stick with that practice, you're going to just open to authenticity in a safe way, meaning your system won't produce things or you won't be expressing things before you're ready, most likely. It'll be more of a natural thing. You'll see it. And then it'll just sort of be integrated into your life over time once you have a consistent practice. And that's really, so there's nothing else that I need to say, because once you experience the authenticity, you don't need me to tell you that authenticity is the way, because you just need to experience it yourself. What I do is just kind of help jumpstart that by trying to make some connections. Let me just see if I can do that for people who are not quite sure about this. Your self-limiting beliefs in relationship, like I'm unlovable and not good enough, you're choosing those. Those aren't just happening. To sit, speaking of the awareness practices and my criticism of them, to sit there and watch a story like I'm not good enough with energy on it come and go is a complete missed opportunity, because that identity comes from what you're afraid to express. You believe in something false because you can't feel and express what's true. So if you just witness that identity, you don't get to the authentic relating. You might get peace or freedom from processing what arises. But if you don't go below the surface, that will come up again to protect you. And then where's the authentic relating going to happen in the relationship if every time you're triggered, you kind of just land on this identity as if this is the real culprit when it's being produced by what's under the water? That's an easy one to start seeing, I think, is when you feel like there's something wrong with you, or that you're lacking or deficient or not good enough or victim. There it is. You're producing it. Your only job is to see how you're producing it. What if I'm right? And I am. Then you're sitting there not learning how you're producing core limiting identities. What that means is you're going to have more of them. That's like arguing in favor of more suffering, to be told that, oh, I'm producing it, but then not taking measures to find it. And what people are doing is they're pretending that their current method gets to it, and it doesn't quite often, and that just keeps them safe. But see, the best teacher in your relationship is the fact that the core limiting feeling and belief or beliefs keep coming up. And then just notice how when they come up, you cannot be real. You cannot get angry or hurt or whatever it is that you've buried. And so you're not showing yourself to the person. The falseness itself will keep that relationship in suffering. Just your falseness, no matter what the other person is doing. Your falseness alone will keep the suffering happening, because it's self-protective and it's not authentic. And therefore, it's driven by the need for safety and love. Someone who's experiencing deep and embodied freedom could be angry in one moment and then crying in the next, but neither one being a trauma response. Neither one coming from frozen fear, because those emotions are thawed out. And to try to get emotions to go away on the path is the repression. We're trying to stay safe. So we try to get our suffering to go away as it comes up. That's the buried emotions. We just don't want to feel stuff. And we want to not have to deal with what we've buried. So we're just in this resistance mode constantly until we get to the buried emotions. The buried emotions are our core resistance, is what I'm saying. So if we ignore our core resistance that's buried, when stuff comes up to the surface, there's resistance to it. It's just how it works. But when we go to the buried emotions, we reduce and then eliminate that resistance to what is. But frankly, stuff stops arising. So this whole idea that just be with what is until it falls away doesn't apply here, really. I mean, it does, because stuff will keep happening, but we go to the root every time. So by getting to the root, you're doing something different. You're not just allowing what's arising. You're actually making conscious the driver so that it can go away much quicker here. So the getting angry and then sad, the reason I bring that up is I experienced that. And I went into my body and I noticed that I didn't have any trauma on it. And it wasn't like the sadness was a protective mechanism for the anger, because I was truly angry, like raw, unfiltered. Raw, unfiltered anger, raw, unfiltered sadness. Completely liberating. Felt wonderful after that. And that changed my life that day, because I understood that my whole path and my whole life and all of my relationships were all about making sure that never could happen so that I could be something false. So just don't let the anger, first of all, and then if the sadness or the hurt comes, identify with it because it's safer, and be that kind of person who's hurt or victim or vulnerable. But with the full on raw, unfiltered anger allowed, there was no identification with that or the sadness. It was just feelings that didn't have anything holding them back. And so I just thought to myself, well, but what about all the teachers who say you're just going to sit there and do nothing and say nothing? Well, first of all, that's what repression does. People don't realize that. That's the mechanism. Don't do anything, don't say anything, don't feel anything. Scary. And then we want to say that that's spirituality or that's the end objective. We've got to be really careful, super careful with that, because that just then becomes a bypass. I even researched, well, do the teachers feel stuff? And then it gave me information. Eckhart Tolle, when his mom died, waves of grief. A lot of teachers don't get angry, though. That makes you wonder. What I've learned is that you've just got to trust yourself. You can't even trust us teachers because there's so much bypassing. And what I've said to people is go into AI chat and trust the collective wisdom, because there's some researchers who are ahead of the curve. They're not doing that thing that teachers do, that downplay the need for boundaries and authenticity. There's some research that's coming forth now saying that our emotional freedom to allow all of our emotions is the way. That if we don't do that, we suffer. So, looking at a way of being in relationship where you just sit there and you don't ever react could just be buried emotions. Or that you react, but you think you're being present. That's what I was doing. It's a complete fucking lie, guys. I'm telling you, we're cultivating presence at the tip of an iceberg, and underneath the iceberg is pure, full-on rage, hurt, fear, and sadness, whatever it may be. And that's the truth. Whether it's buried for you doesn't change it. It's still the truth for you. I say it that way to jar people out of the unconsciousness. What else will jar you out of it if you sit there with buried emotions, demanding that it's not there? You're a classic textbook example of the main duality and the bypass. Let's start to feel now, because that's the way. The way is awareness. Just like the teachings always said, they were always right about that. They never got that wrong, that our fundamental nature is awareness. What they got wrong was that we can't allow it all in awareness because of the buried emotions, which the West was trying to tell us, Freud and Jung, instead of what the East was telling us, which was just sit here as awareness and allow it all and you'll end suffering. Freud said, no, you won't. He didn't know about that spirituality much, but he said, no, that's not it, because it's the unconscious producing the suffering. And until you make the unconscious conscious, then you're going to suffer. And then so many people after Freud got scared, is what I see, and they turned away from his findings because of a few criticisms. They threw away his whole thing, and we're in trouble because of it, I think. In our therapy, in our spirituality, there's a massive bypass, in part because of the ignoring of Freud and Carl Jung in the West, with our Eastern practices too. And the trauma researchers who have been wholly ignored, Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, who have changed the landscape of the healing awakening conversation. But So many people don't know about it. And so then how are you going to experience authentic relating if what you've done, like me, is you've left a relationship because there was repression there and suffering? You're still in a relationship, but you've disconnected somewhat. Now you're looking for answers. You come to this podcast, you go to YouTube, wherever you go for answers. Look at what you're doing. You might be picking things that are keeping you safe so that you never experience that authentic relating. But that's not really what you want if you look. You actually do not want to do that. You don't want to sit here and spend hours listening to me or other teachers only to filter out what's safe and go that direction. Move towards feeling and expressing, and let that happen in awareness fully. Then you have your freedom. So for that, we have to stop turning towards things outside of our relationship. And I say, bring these tools into your relationship. So here's what authentic relating will look like when you do KI. The first phase of the path is where you learn the tools. And there's not going to be much authentic relating. You're going to be learning, and then phase 2 will be doing the work. Phase 2 is a stretch of time in which you're going to resist and want to seek safety and bypass, but we're going to help you through mentorship to stay on board. And phase 2 is characterized by more authentic relating, much less suffering. But there's going to be a barrier for people in phase 2. There'll be people who will insist on turning KI into a quote unquote mistress in phase 2, which means there'll be people who will just not get on board with the idea that ending freedom or ending suffering has to do with feeling and expressing what's true to people. So I saw a bypass in our phase 2 where people want to be free from the modality, but they don't want to go get angry or express their needs or wants or boundaries with people. And so they're just still trying to bypass. So we created a phase 3 here where you turn KI fully into a relational modality in phase 3. Where in phase 1 and 2, it's often about the suffering, but then the suffering goes away. In phase 2, most of it goes away. I mean, there may be some left, of course, because there's still resistance, but then it has to turn towards relational, or we won't see the lack of inauthenticity, because the lack of inauthenticity is not always overt suffering. It's a lack of you showing up. So it's just you're missing. In relationship, you're disconnected. You don't feel and express what's true. You don't say. So therefore, that kind of suffering is more covert. Because we anger repressors, for example, we've survived by just being quiet in relationship. And then that's the source of our suffering, some of us. So we might find ourselves in phase 2, feeling a lot of freedom, but still being kind of quiet to the people that we love. And then we're still experiencing suffering with them because we're not being ourselves. Phase 3 helps you move into authenticity by embodying presence, not just recognizing it, but living it, which means feeling the stuff that you protect yourself from in relationship. And then when you're comfortable expressing that. But really, what KI ends up being, I want to leave you with this. See, people, I think that KI, if you're an anger repressor, they might think, well, I'm just going to end up fucking angry at everybody. You will. That's true. No, you already are. You just buried it. The fact that you can't feel it means nothing. You're still angry at everybody right now. Or if you're hurt by everybody, but it's buried. Think about that. How much you may have missed the mark in spirituality. I missed it big time by not paying attention to the unconscious. But when people have buried anger, they're trying to stay safe by scaring themselves out of getting free. And yet, phase 3 has been characterized by vulnerability for me because it's inescapable. Once you make a modality like this relational, your unmet needs are very vulnerable. No matter if you've buried rage or whatever, you're angry because your needs weren't met. That's really vulnerable. I often mention teachers and others who get sick or engage in scandals or infidelity to help you feel okay about yourself. Because this whole fucking thing about people enlightened and perfect is making people feel bad. It's not even real. There are teachers who have unmet needs and act on them. And you do too. We just miss it in spirituality because we're not paying attention to relationship. But when you process, for example, buried anger in this example, I'm just talking to you guys because you're trying to scare yourselves out of authenticity. You do not become an angry person. You already are. You've just hidden it. Don't fool yourself. And when you get into second phase and you have all this freedom that we have, don't fool yourself. Because this is more than about just ending the suffering that you created for safety. That's just the first step in the suffering that you created. And then be yourself. That's the second step. That's going to be easier and very easy once you end the suffering. But there's going to be a block to it between second and third phase. I've seen it. Everybody wants out early, pretty much. Not everybody. A lot of people want out early because they're seeking safety. They don't want to go all the way into the embodied freedom because they're still listening to the mind that says, I'm just going to be angry. No, you're not. Yeah, you are, but you already are. That emotion will be available to you and conscious. That's what you want, so that you have the full array of qualities of presence then. I cry sometimes once a day after doing anger repression work. That's the feeling that shows up. Because it's like not being afraid anymore to be real and then watching myself be real and how vulnerable that is, including wants or boundaries, and recognizing that that's actually what freedom looks like. And then I did a search on AI, a very extensive search through all the traditions and all of spirituality, psychology, therapy, psychoanalysis, and every one of them, except non-duality, said boundaries are important. Every one of them. In fact, the prevailing wisdom is that boundaries are important. Do you know the spiritual frameworks that talk about the densities? Third density, fourth, and fifth? That's not my framework. They talk about the importance of boundaries. The clearer you get, the more advanced versions of those teachings. It's everywhere that authenticity is the way. But you don't really hear it in the awakening teachings because we're hiding. We're hiding from authentic relating, trying to be free or awakened or healed or whatever by avoiding. Are you tired of that yet? Or have you suffered enough yet? What are you waiting on? Just for the suffering to get worse? Because that's what happens when you avoid what you've buried. You might get freedom at the surface, peace from time to time, but what I got was some really serious diseases from this whole non-dual thing and not taking authenticity and relationship important. It's the most important thing. We just need presence for that because only presence can hold the parts that we've buried. If you want to come work with me in my 90-day one-on-one intensive, this is the kind of thing that we would focus on, perhaps like relational issues. It could be another single focus issue like chronic pain. These are good issues to focus on because generally that's just the way that your repression manifests predominantly. So by working in that area, we get to the driver of all your suffering. It's a great thing. Narrow is the way in that way. If you're thinking about working with me, just come and talk to me for free. There's a link in the description. And if you're not quite ready to work with me, just hold off. In either case, I'm inviting everybody to take the test, repressiontest.com. You're just that much more knowledgeable and insightful about what we're doing here once you take that test. And also I have a Jumpstarter group, which is starting, what is it? It's a Jumpstarter group, meaning I'm going to work in a group with people to jumpstart their skills, context, and capacity for KI so you can start your practice. It's a bridge basically for people out there like you who might be wondering, like, I like what Scott says, but I don't know how to enter this. And also there's the fear of really being seen. So what we're trying to do is be aware of people's trauma as we offer services. And I'm particularly inviting anyone with avoidant conditioning to come to my Jumpstarter group because you don't have to expose yourself one-on-one. You don't even have to speak up. And you can come and learn it directly from me. Thank you for listening.